As Dr. Levine said, that I'm Matthew Melendez, and I'm with my two other group members, Owen and Maya, and we are presenting modeling the symbiosis between vascular plants and mycorrhizal fungi. I'll start off the presentation with, does anyone know where this picture is from?
The Avatar?
It is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Okay, so the only reason I put in this picture is because in Avatar, this tree was supposed to be the big tree in the world that was connected to everything else in the Avatar world. That, if you put your feet on its roots, you could feel everyone in the world. And so I only put that there because that is um, basically how mycorrhizal fungi networks kind of are. They connect the world to other people and plants and whatnot. So yeah. So actual factual, what are mycorrhizal networks? So basically, they're made up of a symbiotic relationship between fungi and trees, or plants in general, and they make up of around 90% of actual forests and whatnot. So they're frequent, almost you'll always see them. The reason for that is because they're really great at helping trees grow and reproduce and whatnot by facilitating water, nitrogen, and like mineral nutrients uptake and getting it from different parts of the soil that tree roots can't access. Other functions that the fungal networks do for the trees is that they share nutrients between other trees. They share information. So if you like in Avatar with the blue people with the trees and how they could hear their ancestors right through, that's basically what this is that like the trees can talk to each other through these networks. And then also interestingly enough that the networks can also sabotage unwelcome plants by releasing toxic nutrients. So yeah, and then also what the fungi are getting out of it is that the tree will give carbohydrates and sugars to the fungi that they cannot readily uptake from the soil. Okay, why does this all matter? Why does the system matter? So the reason the system matters is that it has a lot of applications to real world problems. One of the biggest one I would actually say is like deforestation is like with the Amazon rainforest. We're cutting down a ton of trees at alarming rates, and the forest just cannot keep up with the amount of destruction. And so that if we studied these networks, we could actually implement in the soil. You could mix in this fungi, and hopefully it would actually help with like regrowth of forests. Another thing is soil erosion and drought. Fungi, because they live in soil, they actually hold moisture and they hold the soil together so that you don't have soil erosion and mudslides and whatnot. Another one is crop cultivation. Because these networks can uptake moisture and water from different parts of the soil that trees and like crops cannot access, they're really great at water utilization so that we're not using a ton of water for crops and whatnot, which is a very big problem right now, especially out in the West. And then overall ecology. I will pass this over to Maya.
Sure, yeah. So when sort of developing the model, we had to try to decide what like the currency of our system would be. So what exactly we were going to use to transfer between the fungi and the trees and the patches that they're on. So at first we started with nutrients, and it led us to making assumptions that we couldn't really back up with research. So we ended up settling on biomass. So basically the way our model works is we have turtles, which are trees, which are like situated on patches, and each patch has patch nutrients, which the trees absorb. Yeah, and biomass is also used in different ways where it sort of interacts with the network, which is sort of on the next slide. Yeah, and so when a tree dies, this is where we have it interacting with the network itself. So there's a portion of it where the biomass can be transferred to connected neighbors, which are turtles or trees that are connected by the fungi, and so a proportion of that tree's biomass goes to those neighbors, and it can also have a proportion that is just kind of given to the patch that it's currently on. That could, I guess, get reused later on. Yeah, and then biomass also sort of plays into reproduction. We had a paper that sort of gave us a relationship between like a tree diameter and the amount of biomass allocated to reproduction, which is proportional to sort of the number of seeds produced by that tree. And so via this relationship between diameter and reproductive biomass, we were able to find a relationship relating sort of the cross-sectional area of the trunk, which is sort of related to its capacity to absorb biomass from the soil around it, to the number of seeds that we could produce. So this gives sort of a graph of seeds produced versus the biomass. I think you're on mute.
I think you're muted.
Sorry. So the next part of our modeling, I guess how we set it up is that we then said, how does, the network grow? So the first way that the network can grow is that every time a tree reproduces a sapling, it has a chance to connect to its sapling, which is also supported by a ton of evidence that like in these networks, there'll be mother trees and that they will mostly be like connected to their saplings or saplings in general around them so that they can supply nutrients to help the sapling grow and reach reproductive maturity. And then the next way that the network can grow is neighbor to neighbor. That's just normal. The fungi are growing. And so then it finds a new tree and then it connects, two trees to each other. But usually they have to be in the same neighborhood or, around patches of like radius, right? In close proximity. And then the other way is inheritance, which basically means that every time a tree dies, it has a chance of its neighbors have a chance of linking to each other. So we originally had it that when a tree died, the networks or the connections that that tree had would totally go away. And then we were like, well, that doesn't really make sense because, just because a tree dies doesn't mean like the fungi die. So then we were like, okay, so every time a tree dies, it has the trees around it and the other patches have a chance to connect to each other through the fungal network.
So for actually testing this model, we tested three big parameters. So the nutrient share, which is the percentage of nutrients transferred through the network whenever a tree dies, the percent chance or the fungi growth probability, which is how likely is the fungi to grow, and then the offspring connection probability, which is how likely is it to grow to its offspring specifically rather than just the nearest neighbors. And then we tracked a set of metrics for all of them, which was the peak and net biomass throughout the trial, so that we could see both the idea of maybe these networks or the lack thereof is leading to like a really steep boom and a crash versus a slow growth. That's why we track both peak and net. And then also we tracked fungi connection degree and net fungi links, which those were to sort of see how is the network itself affected by things like nutrient share. So how much nutrients is being transferred from the network? How does that affect the actual network size and the network growth? And so we'll start out with the nutrient share metric, which this had very sort of obvious results that came out to us right after we did the test, which we saw a big increase in biomass and tree population. So you can see, and also that increase was much more focused in the net biomass, which strongly implies, but we don't have the data 100% backed up, that the expansion was more of a long-term growth and like a bigger overall population rather than just like peaks at some point in the data and crashing of the network. And in the same way, we saw network links increase, which is of course partially due to the fact that we have more trees in the network. And so yeah, here you can see the graphs for biomass, and there's an obvious difference in these graphs between the net biomass and the peak biomass. And it's just that the net biomass is increasing more from where it began. And we have the same thing showing in our population graph. It looks very similar, which again makes sense, sort of validates our model because population should be very similar to biomass as all of our growth is based on biomass. And then we also have the network links increasing, matching that as we expect. And so the next thing we tested was neighbor to neighbor growth of these fungal networks. And so as we see, just like we saw with the nutrient exchange, the increased neighbor to neighbor growth made it much, like dramatically increase the size of our population and the regular population. And this also you see, just like before, the increase in degree and network links. But that is much more expected, even more so than it is before, because we're literally increasing the percentage chance of it to create a link. So if there should be more links in the network. And so, yeah, as we look at this graph, we see the average and the peak biomass are both increasing, and as well as the population is also increasing. And then, yeah. The network links, again, sort of validating the effectiveness of this model to some degree. It shows that we are actually increasing number of links, which is what we expect when we are increasing the probability of a link to grow. And then the last metric we changed was the offspring connection percentage. So this is not the nearest neighbors, but just the close, any offspring. So when a tree has an offspring. And so this was like very interesting, as none of the metrics had any significant change across the trials. They were all like flatlined, random, and so that sort of strongly implies that it's much more important for the network to care about just growing to close trees rather than it does that it's growing to its offspring specifically. And so there isn't really any benefit to discriminating towards offspring in close trees, and that might be a failure in our model, but also could be representative of the system as a whole. We're unsure.
Right, so sort of given the observations we had from the general tests, we wanted to sort of see if the advantage provided by the network in like growing biomass of the forest and all of these other metrics could actually transfer to sort of a change in response to a stress like deforestation. So we wrote up a bit of NetLoco code that sort of takes a patch of given dimension and clears it of all of its turtles after a certain point in the forest's growth. So I think we set it at like 100 ticks. And after that point, the forest can regrow, continuing to form links and populate the area that was deforested as is sort of natural to a real deforested area. And so, yeah, as we would have expected, you see the little, we have like growth of the forest as natural, and then you see the little dip, and that is where we activated the deforestation, and then it continues to sort of grow afterwards. Yeah, so this is just sort of showing the effect there. So we ran a little bit of like some tests in like behavior space, and so we're basically here comparing the response to deforestation in a network where all of our like connection parameters were set to 0 versus the ones that were set to the normal values of a well-connected forest network. So the one in orange is the well-connected one, while the one in blue is one with like no links. And we would sort of expect the peak biomass, as like Owen said in his portion, that like the peak biomass of a well-connected network should just be more due to the nature of nutrient sharing there. But we also sort of see a change in behavior. So after the deforestation event occurs, which is where the black line is, we have this sort of flatlining of the peak biomass. But with the well-connected network, we see a slight gradual trend upward, which suggests that maybe having links may allow a forest to sort of recover better and not just flatline. after a deforestation event.
Okay. So what are some of our major conclusions that we have observed or learned from our experiments? So we, of course, like we expected, one of the biggest conclusions is that having a fungal network increase the size of a forest. No, surprise to that. But also the more interesting thing is that neighbor to neighbor fungal growth is more important than offspring to like parent fungal growth, which is not really what we saw in literature. In literature, it usually said that, mother to offspring fungal growth was more important because, these mother trees would be these like nutrient sinks, and then basically they could like equally disperse their nutrients to their offspring. And so then they said that was more important than, just the fungal network growing and then finding different neighbors. Um, like I just said, fungal networks may provide resilience to a forest after like stressors like deforestation or like drought or whatever. Um, and then also an increase in tree population and biomass with more fungal growth could be useful for forest restoration by manually like adding the fungi, like I said previously, to like the soil when you're like trying to regrow it. And so that is really important for like, a lot of like issues today, especially like with like global warming, because, without forests, like, without forests in general, then, the global warming problem is just going to get even worse. More carbon, more greenhouse gases. So I think it's really important that we look into ways to like see how can we at like after forest fires, how can we regrow that forest as fast as possible? And we believe that fungal networks could definitely be a solution to that. And then some of our, like shortcomings in our model was that we didn't really expect that the network would be so complex in how it has so many different functions. I mean, these networks supply many different types of nutrients, water, you have like carbon and sugar and like energy flowing through these networks that are also being taken up by the fungi too. And then also it's also being like secreted into soil. And then also like, you know, we haven't even gotten to like diseases and how that affects that network, which is also super complex. And then honestly, one of the biggest like, bullet to the project was the lack of data. There was so much research on like how these networks are made up of and like what they can do, but there was no like quantitative data on them. Nothing we could compare our model to, nothing to say, oh, this is how much like, carbon or whatever is like uptaked by this tree and then like the when they passage through the network, then half of this, right? We didn't have any quantitative data to help us with this, so we were almost like going in blind with a lot of these metrics and parameters that we came up with. And then also, of course, the time constraint. I mean, we did this in basically a month. So, yeah. But I feel like the big takeaway from this is that, we've learned how to work with um, data that we don't have, but still come up with a somewhat approximate slash accurate model of a biological system. But also another takeaway is that we know that biological systems, it's nature, and it's not going to really work how you want it to because that's just how nature works. It's variable, it's erratic, it's not something that numbers can usually perfectly predict. And I feel like that's a great lesson just in general. So yeah, that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening. We can take questions now.
I have a question for you guys. Just not a super highbrow question. but because our team was kind of struggling with something similar. What is the time scale of this? Like for these networks to grow, is this a couple days, couple weeks, couple months? Like what's the kind of
Um,
window for this?
so there's probably no data on that either that I found, but and my hunch is that it takes years. Just like a forest takes a long, long time to develop. I mean, like I think some of our endpoints were like 500 years before like the forest would like totally collapse. So like we're talking a long time for these networks to fully develop, but once they do develop, it's really hard for them to like, go away because they have so much connections. I read this one paper that said some of these connections can span over continents, and span over multiple like countries, which is really like mind-boggling on how big they are. Um, but yeah, I would say a long time for these to get established.
I kind of have a follow-up question. Do you think that this really, really long time scale is the reason that maybe not as much quantitative research has been released on this because it just takes so long to even get to this point?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, like it was really surprising on how little quantitative data there are about trees in general. I mean, like we were like a simple question like how long does a tree live is not really like researched because some trees can live thousands of years and then some trees can live, 100 years. But also there's some trees that are still living where we don't know when they were like birthed, you know? Like some trees that are older than civilization. So also the other thing is like no one really knows when a tree will die because it seems like they can live a very, very long time and mostly outlive humans. So it is a very, very hard question and a very, very difficult experiment if you want quantitative data because it does take a really long time.
We have time for one more question.
I guess I'll ask, what was the thing that most surprised you in this project?
Well, for me personally, what surprised me was really the lack of information and data because all of the research I've done previously, I've always had these archives of many, many different research papers with data and methods and, experiments that I could look for and get some type of like quantitative number that I could use in like my experiments. And then I come here and try to tackle this modeling problem and I'm like, wow, there's really nothing I can use. And it's a really mind-boggling thing to like switch over to that mindset of okay, I have to come up with parameters myself without any like evidence to support it, which is not really like what we think of like the empirical like scientific method and whatnot, which was a very big surprise for me.
And Maya and Owen, did you have similar or different experiences?
I'll say I agree with what Matthew said, but also something that very much surprised me. So like we spent a good amount of time like developing this model, setting it all up, and we hadn't really run like big trials because they take a long time to run until this past week. And I was in some ways just surprised that like we actually got information that sort of in some ways validates like if a network is there, it can resist fire and like regenerates faster from fire. And that's sort of like an interesting thing that there was no way for us to test that until we ran the data for the longer simulations. And I think it's very cool and surprising that those results did end up coming out based off the simple modeling.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Owen and Matthew. And I think for me was something also that we kind of came upon in the last week was like just how narrow the parameters that sort of worked for the like forest and like actually so there's a very very like narrow range of values that sort of had a forest being stable and acting as it should. So that was also sort of interesting.